Welcome to Business Mastery with Dawn Kennedy, your quick under 45-minute dose of expert insights and strategies to make a positive impact on your business and life. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Business Mastery Podcast. So today we're going to be talking all about psychological safety in your business, why it's so important, why you need to have a culture of psychological safety, not just for your employees and the people who work there, but for your customers as well. And I have Francie on here to talk to us all about it. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, lady. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited for this topic. It's so important. Can you tell everyone who you are and who you serve?
Sure. So I'm Francie Jain, and I'm the founder of a company called Terawatt. And we are like the Airbnb of group coaching. It's probably the best way to understand what we do, which is that we work with coaches. They have their own practice and know their own specialties, right? We are agnostic about everything, but we believe that we can help employers bring group coaching and group training to their organizations, and we help them find the exact right person to work with. And a lot of times people will say, why? Or that's not really in the budget or whatever. But ultimately, the science and the math is that the greater the level of psychological safety at your organization, the lower the employee turnover. And a lot of times people say, oh, listen, we have industry average turnover. This is just the cost of doing business. And what I say, is there any other aspect of your business that you're happy with being average? Because that's silly.
Right.
No need, and turnover affects retained earnings. So any money you save on replacing and recruiting new people is money that goes straight to the bottom line. And there's so that is basically the definition of return on investment. And so what I'm just trying to do is bring the whole world, like the knowledge that all the science is out there. This is all proven information that can really help any business. I specifically love to work with hospitals or healthcare because these are employees who don't get a lot of management training.
So before we go into the different roles and the training, let's just, for everybody listening, what do you mean when you say psychological safety in an organization?
Yeah, a very cool woman named Dr. Amy Edmondson defined this. And it's really cool because it's not even an individual perception. It's a group feeling. It's a group, if you will, vibe that they are free in this and such, whenever the environment is, to say exactly how they feel, exactly what they think, without fear of repercussions or losing status or losing a promotion. The idea is that the high psychological safety organizations are organizations where all voices matter, which is, can sound a little woo-woo, but what it really means is that people are more focused on the process and getting it right than on always being perfect. And as we know, like as humans, like there's always going to be an error here or there, but the best we can really do in any organization is just constantly improve the processes to understand where humans make errors and then mitigate those. So, for instance, what's really interesting is when you have a low psychologically safe environment, people don't report errors because there's no upside. That individual will probably get in trouble. It won't be considered a process fault or process issue, and they don't really feel like standing out. However, once psychological safety goes up, then errors start getting reported more. So what happens is you'll see like a spike in errors as people start being more free about just talking about what's going on. And then people start to fix the processes, and then the errors go down. But it's really, that was one of Dr. Edmondson's like big findings, is that high psychological safety is correlated with higher errors because they're reported.
So when we talk about high psychological safety, one of the biggest things that when you read any literature about leadership is that maturing beyond having to be right. So you need to be right all the time. And that means that everybody else either needs to do it differently or maybe they're wrong in their perception. And let's talk a little bit about what has to happen on that management layer to even be able to bring in this psychological safety where people can report errors, because I think that's something when they do leadership training and things like that. I don't know that we talk enough about the fact that there's a perception that management layer has to be right, or that perception that they are always right. And that is actually one of the major issues that prevents a psychological safety environment.
Yeah. In fact, actually, I would underline that what you're saying 100%. I think there's also this, in my business especially, it's not a really common thing to do, right? So it's considered a risk in an organization to pay for people to come from the outside to do something that may not work, especially if you don't fully believe in it. And putting money on the line as is seen as a risk. And that's a tough thing for people in the management space. I think that generationally, it's also can be a problem. I know that I'm Gen X, and when I was a young worker, I remember very distinctly being told, and just the norms were that all professional development happened outside of work. That was my own thing. And they weren't going to pay for it. And that was my own time. And the perception was, listen, like, why would I pay to make you better? You'll just leave because make you more valuable employee. And that perception's actually 180 degrees away from where we are now, because now the younger generations, millennial, Gen Z, they expect professional development at their employer. And if it's not there, they will leave. So actually providing professional development, which isn't really that expensive in the broad scheme of things, delays them leaving. So some people might say, oh, this is great. And they might stay for 10 years because they feel like you're really invested in them. And someone else might leave after a year. But the point is that they're going to leave anyway. So if they stay for 5 years, isn't that better than 1 year? And then if you talk to a CFO type person, or someone who's a little more analytic with the numbers and the revenue, the perception could be, how much are you willing to spend to increase retention? And that's like the CFO perspective.
Right. And when we first started, you were saying that the ROI is the fact that you're retaining employees, trained employees, people will stay, and you don't have those turnover metrics that are very expensive. So my next question to you is, what is the obligation, even in the early hiring phases, to let people know, or to somehow screen for people who are looking for an environment of psychological safety? Because I don't know if they're even screened for it. I think there's sometimes a perception that somebody's a good culture fit for other reasons, but when it comes down to it, they're not people who would maybe want to report problems or want to make trouble. I think that there's a little bit on that side as well before you can get into the development.
Oh gosh, that's so interesting. Yeah, you could see maybe many years ahead. There are tests right now where you can test psychological safety of an organization. It's free, and individuals. Those are things you can do online. And that would be incredible, right? Where in addition to saying we're like one of the top 100 employers, it's also, we have a psychological safety score of 100 or whatever the thing is. That would be an incredible thing to tell employees. I think it's just not that well known enough to be able to market that. But to me, that's almost like the whole thing of saying, I always thought when I work for other people that I'd rather have a good boss than have a good job, or I almost didn't even care what I was doing as long as I had a really good boss. Because I feel like the people that really motivate you, who are really interesting, like that to me is like the whole reason to be there. And it's like, that's the same thing. Sometimes it's impossible to know because you're interviewing, you have 2 or 3 interviews with somebody and they give you a job offer. Like, it's impossible to know this is going to be like the healthiest relationship you've ever had or the unhealthiest.
Okay. So other than people feel more free to report problems and to work on processes, what are some of the other things that you can point to and say, oh, that's definitely a psychologically safe organization?
Oh yeah, the really famous one that just blows my mind is Google did a study, and it was called Project Aristotle, and they published it in the New York Times, and they were trying to figure out what united, what was like how can you characterize the best teams at Google? And they didn't define what best teams mean. So for our purposes, I'm going to define it, which means created probably most profitable products, because that's what their company is, right? So let's say they created Gmail, or they created, I don't know, Google Maps, or I don't know how they monetize their business that well, but let's just say, right? And they really looked for years, and it wasn't like gender or colleges or which coast they lived on or which city, or male leader, female, all these kind of different ways to dissect it, and they were able to find it. And I think that secretly they worked with Dr. Edmondson because when I reread it after I spent a lot of time with her work, I was like, oh, actually, this sounds actually a lot like her. But so what they found was the single uniting thing on the best teams was high psychological safety. And what it meant for product development is that it's the opposite of groupthink. So, for instance, like groupthink, we also really always have that, or at least I always have that memory of New Coke. And that was the famous example of groupthink, where everyone bet the same way. And this one team that was developing New Coke. And New Coke is when they replaced all the Coke, literally, like the bottles of Coke and all the supermarkets around America, the new formula. And they were all thinkers in the Myers-Briggs sort of spectrum, which is a way to like just understand how you see the world, as opposed to feelers, because they didn't talk to any feelers. And the feelers, which it turns out I'm a feeler, were, well, that is not what I want. I want what I want. I don't want to be told what is the better new thing. And so those are two examples. So groupthink is what you don't want. That's the opposite of high psychological safety. And then just being and the Google thing, like I think, underscores this idea of being comfortable diverging from like how the group is evolving or thinking or speaking about. So I think in the Google case, to me, it always strikes me that it's probably someone who is saying, or several people are saying in the group, this might not work for this one small group. But say, oh, like here's like, I'm not sure if you read the article or saw during the Super Bowl that Ring has been to come out with.
Yes.
Series. Yeah, they're going to connect to all their houses and they're going to
Lost dog.
lost dogs. And when you first hear it, you think that's awesome. Who doesn't want to help a lost dog? And then all the privacy people in the world are like, this is the worst idea I've ever heard. Who knows who's going to get control of this? What if an abuser is trying to find someone? And anyway, and so then they had to recall it and say, we don't want to do this. And that's always, to me, a sign that everyone's like the same in marketing, in product creation, all this stuff. And so what you want is to have someone who thinks differently and sees things differently. So they can say, you should talk to women who are abused. Would they think this is a good idea? What about privacy experts? What would they think about this? And so that's, again, like improving the process. And so it's obviously an error the same way it might be like the medical field. But it's an error in business. And think about all the money you spent for number one on the Super Bowl ad, which is like few million, I don't know, it's like $1 million a second or something. And then just the egg on your face that you have to retract an idea and embarrassment in the market, and is that going to impact sales? And it's all that kind of stuff. So it comes up in different ways in different kind of organizations, but mostly it's just like a little bit getting to the truth, I think, is ultimately the kind of the way I think about it.
Okay, and let's talk about the downstream effects of all of your employees having that safety to think outside the box or to work with other groups or to talk amongst themselves or to bring you process issues that naturally is going to flow through better customer service, less fear of making mistakes, being more empowered maybe to solve something at a shorter level, if you will, when there's a complaint, so there's no escalation. So I know that there are some downstream impacts when you have an organization where people feel like I'm safe to do my job and I'm not going to get in trouble. What are some of the other things that people should be considering if they're looking at their organization and going, are we really set up for everyone to report? Are we really set up for everyone to feel good here?
Yeah, gosh. Another way to think about it is something that's very rigidly hierarchical in almost like a 19th century way is a good sign. Like when I have like here's an example from the hospital space, but I spoke to a bunch of nurses at some point, and they all had like very similar stories of if ever there was a group, and included doctors and nurses and other organizations, the nurses, and let's say they were all like on a working group to eliminate infection in the like patient rooms or something like that. And they're just looking for like human ideas. The nurses were told that their ideas were not important because they weren't doctors. And the ideas that came out of the working group idea brainstorming only could come from the doctors. And that's just crazy. That's not even like 21st century living. You know what I mean? It's like, how can you say that one kind of professional is subhuman or doesn't have the full brain or something. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And part of that whole thing is like, you want people different expertise to weigh in, right? If you're a nurse, you're much more frontline than a doctor is, which would actually make a lot more sense if the nurses would be involved in infection prevention, because they would probably say, oh, you know what everyone does is XYZ. And if God, we get rid of that, it would really prevent infection. And you're just not going to know everything. You can't be omniscient as in any role.
So inside this hierarchical structure that you see even in business, do you see that sometimes there might be a group that has more psychological safety than maybe another group in the same organization, and then that lives up to the top?
That's the Google thing. So that's the Google thing. That's what's so fascinating is like you have one company and like and that's what kind of what silos are a little bit too. You have people doing their own little organism. And so there absolutely can be some groups that are really psychologically safe in one organization, some groups that aren't. I think what's interesting though to me when I start to think about that is, well, then what happens when someone who's been reporting upward is that, because that's kind of where the rubber hits the road a little bit, right? Because if the person reporting up to and you're saying, hey, we want to come up with this new product, we want to make this change, that person, it's going to be tricky to figure out it might be tricky to figure out how to work with that person. Because if that person's very open to ideas, then that can work really well. But if they're, again, like really hierarchical and they want to be the one with the idea, I don't know. You know what I mean? It could be hard. So I always think about that as like these like tiers, but somehow these good ideas are getting through. So it suggests that management is more psychologically safe, I think, at Google, because also the other way to think about it is their business is innovation. So they have to be open to new ideas and experimenting, where other places might be just a lot more conservative and say, like we were just talking about now, like if it's going to cost money, we're just not going to experiment on that. That's not a good use.
So the psychological safety, and you're talking about the management layer and the leadership layer, because I think that is the place where we have to set the line, set the tone. But how do you see this also inside coworkers with psychological safety in groups?
Yeah.
Maybe there's no leadership involved in a particular decision. Two people can get together and discuss an issue and try to solve it, or two people can't. Where do you see that the most? And how do we look at that? Because I do see there's often a bright line when leadership development starts. You hit a certain title or you get a certain promotion, and then all of a sudden you're being sent to leadership development, or you're being in those groups now where you're learning these additional management skills. So where do you think it should actually start? And should it be below the leadership level? Should it be at a coworker level?
Yeah. So one coach I work with, his process, which I love, is he believes that doing psychological safety stuff has to start with the C-suite, because it really everyone has to like be learning the same thing, or else it just won't get as far as it could. So his process was always have the CEO and the CFO, whoever the top few leaders are, do the training first, and then make it opt in, but have everyone know that the C-suite has already done this. And so it's on people's own volition. You don't have to do it. But I think then what starts to happen is people start to see like how much better it feels to not be as rigid or open to problem solving. So that's the one thing I would say. I really do think that everyone has to be on the same on board. And there's this incredible case study that we have about a hospital in Colorado that had 24% employee turnover, and they needed to get it down. I think hospitals on average are like 18 to 20%. So it's above average. And what they did was they brought in psychological safety training and coaching. They started with the C-suite and there's opt-in. And every year their employee turnover went down 1% to 2%, and it's compounded. And after 9 years, they're at 4% employee turnover. Again, industry standards like 18 to 20. They started getting awards. It was really easy to hire people because they had gone from being one or two applications per open role to 20 or 40. Just crazy number. Just everyone wanted to work there because they knew it was a great place. But what's crazy about all of this is it sounds great. And you're like, good for them. Yay. It was really good numbers. But it was 4,000 people, this hospital system. And so the difference between 24% turnover and 4% turnover was $32 million a year.
Yeah.
And that's real money. And $32 million a year is now you can be like proactive and you can decide, what are we going to do with that this year? Is that going to be bonuses for our employees? Are we going to build a new building? Are we going to do some R&D? Are we going to buy machines? You can decide. You decide. And if you're able to like keep that momentum up and keep the conversations going and the sort of functional working together, working, then that just ends up being a completely different organization than what it had been with 24%, where they were like probably overpaying for temporary workers and headhunters and a lack of like institutional knowledge. You can imagine like
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I also wanted to, when you said it took about 9 years, I'm like, that
Yeah.
sounds about right. But yeah, how much institutional knowledge is now staying?
Yeah.
The $32 million aside, which could, of course, be reinvested, that is not only a huge cost savings, but what does that show to the industry that this is not only truly possible? You have this one case study. Wouldn't that spark other organizations with maybe the same headcount to consider that to be a true? Because everybody always wants to say we have the newest, latest, and greatest, or we have the newest strategy, the newest idea. But really, taking 9 years to do it seems probably about right. And having that sustainability for almost a decade, watching that trend go down. Was this something that made the other organizations pick up the phone and go, we want to do the same thing?
Okay, this is my big question. Because I keep thinking this is so monumental. I don't understand
Yeah.
why this didn't ricochet through the industry. And so the guy who was the CEO who did this, he left after a little while and went into consulting. And I think that the consultants thought they could sell this to hospitals. And then after a while, he went to a different area, or switched careers a little bit. And I think that I'm not sure why. I think it's because hospitals are a little bit more conservative and maybe it sounded like too good to be true. Actually, right now, what I'm trying to do is work on a grant where I can get funding to bring this to hospitals to say, you don't have to pay anything. Let's just do this kind of coaching and training and test it ourselves in a peer reviewed way and write it up in an academic journal. Because I just keep thinking, like, this is crazy. I just don't understand why this hasn't run around like wildfire. And even was like looking at that guy's background and like, is he an honest man? Was this he? Yeah. And everything seemed very legit. That organization ended up merging into larger
Sure.
academic group. So I don't know the answer, but what I'm trying to figure out is that replicable?
Right. Yeah, I wonder if it's personality based. It doesn't sound like it though, because there is a lot of evidence that there are people that can be trained into having for years. What do they call it? The open door policy, right? So for years, it's like the open door policy, whatever. And I think to your point, we've moved away from that and we've moved into, hey, listen, I'm here to do a job. I want to be treated as an adult. I want to have an opportunity to expand and grow. And I want to be safe bringing any errors or mistakes, or if I see a process improvement or something, I want to be able to bring that to somebody who can maybe look at it, maybe do something about it, maybe not, but can look at it. And I'm just curious, as to your point, generationally, we've been doing this. Leadership development in this realm has been around for a very long time. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about why it isn't maybe something that we see more in small business trainings or in those places where maybe there's 40 employees instead of 4,000, or maybe there's 200 employees instead of 4,000. What I don't think it's personality based. I think there are just some people who maybe came from corporate, open to business, they've had this training, they've been in the C-suite. But what are your thoughts about how you would implement this in a smaller business and where you can find this information?
Oh, yeah. One thing, just to get back to your earlier question, which touches on this, which is what about peer to peer? Because
Yeah.
you asked about that, I didn't answer that. And that's part of this training that this one coach has done. And basically his point is peer to peer, what it looks like is just flexible problem solving. Instead of saying, we've got a problem, you didn't do XYZ, this is the protocol. And the other person saying, actually, I didn't do XYZ because of this wrinkle. And the two people saying, oh, okay, let's work around that. Let's find a way to make this work. It's not about I'm right, you're wrong, that kind of thing. It's really more about alignment to the North Star of the organization, whatever like everyone's trying to do, like they're all in the same place, right? Because ultimately, no one employs a bunch of people so they can run around saying, I'm right, you're wrong. But everyone's employed to do something, right? And the business has some purpose, whether you're making tires or you're doing consulting, whatever the thing is, right? There's some goal that you're all supposed to be growing towards. And the kind of I'm right, you're wrong stuff really takes away from that momentum. And so I think that's the way you would talk about it with peer to peer, which is much more like flexible problem solving, understanding that there are benefits to both sides, benefits to what you're thinking about and benefits to the person you're having a conflict with. So for smaller organizations, like my thing is in my little presentations I can share with you, I list like QR codes, places where they're free resources. And like, for instance, Dr. Amy Edmondson has the LinkedIn course that you can take for free if you do a LinkedIn learning trial. And then there's that organization I mentioned briefly that does group testing for psychological safety. And you can take a free test through them. And then also the coach that I love to talk about, Dr. Tommy Thomas. He has that's a great name. I know, right? It's like the best. You'll never forget his name.
You never forget his name. What a great name. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was.
Yeah, no, it's not, I always have, yeah, exactly. Because if you say Dr. Thomas, you're like, does he make English muffins? But if you say Dr. Thomas, you're like, oh, that's the one guy, Dr. Thomas. I love it. But he also has a free test for individuals just to have a better sense of like how you think. And so that's definitely a thing. I think a really good way to do it, just the DIY, is have everyone read the same book on psychological safety and have just like a weekly book group discussion or something. And just have people talk about what they thought was interesting. Because ultimately, psychological safety happens in groups, right? It is about speaking in groups with people. It's not about one-to-one coaching, right? If I spend 10 hours with you, I'm like, you are great at psychological safety. Okay. But the point is not about you with one other person. It's like you within the context of a larger organization or a group. And so I think that anything you can do to replicate the group dynamic, I think is really valuable. Or even having someone who could be a moderator. Maybe you could do a role play, I guess, kind of thing, where maybe from any kind of book you're reading or just even from stuff you're having, issues you have often in the workplace, like someone takes one role, someone else takes another role, and you role play it out and people give feedback and there's a discussion and they can talk about what it feels like to be in that role. And I think as more people get more empathy for the other person and start to realize the goal isn't that you are always right. The goal is like whatever the point of the business is or the organization is. That's what we're all here to do. And sometimes people forget that, right? Because we're all like in our head and we get pissed because you're doing it wrong. I'm doing it right. Like the joke in this whole thing is I'm not like a perfect person, right? So I'm always like thinking like you are the worst driver, like when I'm driving down the street. And so sometimes you have to write, oh, I guess I see why they would do that. And you have to have empathy and like ebb and flow a little bit. And I think we all have to like put our thinking caps on to be really good in this realm, or at least I know I have to work at it. But it's that kind of stuff and I guess my point is there's a lot you can do at the DIY level, or then you can always bring in people who are experts in this. And again, I'm not a coach. I'm more just like a believer in this. This should be more in industry and in medicine. And I think you can do whatever. You could go apply to LinkedIn and find a million coaches who are experts in psychological safety. You want to hire someone. So I think and one of the things that I also pitch in like this presentation I'm about to give is, what if you did a DIY version, measured like retention before and retention after? You'd have to get a little bit like the data about like people leaving and really separate out the control group and all the different things that you'd have to do. But once you did that, you could say, listen, after we did our DIY book club, and let's say there's a 20-person, it's a back of the envelope, but let's say it's like a 20-person organization. We did our book club where it was a conversation about psychological safety, and we did it 6 weeks. In the 3 months before, we had 8 people quit. In the 3 months after, we had 2 people quit. And how much did we spend? The cost of the books, and maybe you add a little bit of cost, the cost of time that people are spending on the book club as opposed to working. And then you can create return on equity. And then you can also look at what you spent to replace those people versus before and after. So like one of the things that's also really important in working space, I think even in medicine, I think almost every organization, it's like the cost to replace a worker is somewhere between 1 times and 2 times their salary. It could be multiples of, it could be even higher than that depending on the thing. But that's a very conservative way to look at it. So it's just a really easy back of the envelope where you say, hey, we lost 8 people. Okay. 8, add up their salaries. That's the cost to replace them. We lost 3 people afterwards. Okay, add up all their salaries. That's the cost to replace afterwards. And you're spending like less than half when 3 people have left versus
Right.
you have the more than, you've
Yeah, there's
the numbers, but
yeah.
right. And that to me is just like wild. And then you can get much more in the weeds and you can talk about like control groups or 30-day stay or 60-day stay. And
Yeah.
I mean, you could get as like numbery as you want, but the idea is that, and then my point is, what's cool about that is looking at then the ROI. So let's say all you were doing was bought 40 books that cost $20 each. That was your spend, right? And then you saved 5 salaries. And then what's the return on investment?
So that's the financial return. Absolutely. But my last question, I guess, to you about this is, if you're listening to this podcast today and you don't know if your organization is psychologically safe, what would be a couple of questions you could ask yourself whether or not you need to implement something like that?
Oh, good question. I think the first one is, do you ever stop yourself from saying something? Or has there ever been a situation where you think it's not worth it? There's no point in me trying to improve this process or mention this to somebody else because nothing's going to change.
Oh,
Or I'm not getting trouble.
Yeah.
Those would be big ones. I think one of the things I always think about is that feeling of psychologically safe to me is just when everyone's rowing in the same direction. There's just no drama. There's no politics, right? Everyone's doing good jobs. You're just all working. You're just trying to do the best you can, as opposed to sharp elbows, gossiping, and what the boss like today.
Right.
Rigmarole that's just wildly distracting to the purpose of being there.
Right. No, that's great. So where can people find you? And then also we will put the resources that Francie described down inside the show notes and then also in the YouTube description. So whenever you find this episode, whether it's when we launch or 2 years from now, you'll be able to find all of the resources. They're very important. So where can people find you? And if they need to get a referral to somebody who can help their organization?
Yeah, I love this. Terawatt, the website is just terawatt.co. So TERAWATT.co. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. We have a little teeny presence on YouTube, mostly from podcasts, I would say. There's a little bit of Terawatt on there. Yeah, and I'll give you all these. And what we'll do is we'll give you even these resources with QR codes.
Oh.
And it can be a really nice way also to find the book or to find the LinkedIn course or whatever, because sometimes keywords can be to search. But and so anyway, there's a lot of DIY stuff. And I would just, especially now with AI, right? You can get really into the weeds and ask for lots of suggestions. And I think just to say, listen, how can I get smarter with this?
Right.
Just be, creative and open and curious.
Yeah, we did do an episode over a year ago on quiet quitting. And one of the things that came out with the quiet quitting, we're talking about different benefits and different ways that companies were structuring to try to keep employees without necessarily maybe increasing salary. I don't know in this quiet quitting discussion if we really talked a whole lot about psychological safety. I think there was just an assumption that was there. So this is definitely another angle. If you are not having good retention or if you are not maybe maximizing the empowerment of your employees, this might be something to look at because it doesn't take too many people in an organization to make the workplace feel less psychologically safe. It really doesn't take that many people at all.
Yeah. As you're saying that, you're just jogging my memory. There's also this incredible book, and I'll put this on the list too. It's called Turn the Ship Around. And so here we are, right? In this conversation, we've been talking about business, so like Google, hospitals, right? But guess what? It also works in the military.
Mm-hmm.
So this book is called Turn the Ship Around. It's like the best book I've ever read in my life. I think I've read it like 3 times in like the past year. And it's about a guy who is, I think, I believe the captain of a nuclear submarine in the Navy. And to run a nuclear submarine is a very hard job because the boat could blow up at any minute. And so everything has to be very like carefully done. And so the guy, he doesn't call it psychological safety, but it's basically what he was doing. And instead of everything being top down, which is like him deciding on which bolt goes in where, he flipped it to being bottom up so that instead of saying, can I use this bolt? The people come to him and say, sir, I intend to use this bolt because XYZ ABC. And he would either ask a few questions and say yes, or ask a few questions and say, come back to me, no, this doesn't feel right. And it changed the whole dynamic on the ship. And they went from like last in, they have these like reviews, like it was like war games. They were like last in reviews to number 1. And then all these people started getting promoted, and then everyone wanted to come on their ship. And I always loved it because I think, especially from like the baby boomer toxic masculinity vibe, we always assume, what could be more hierarchical and potentially toxic in the military? But here's an example of like strong processes, strong hierarchy, and still it's psychologically safe, right? These are people, again, same thing, like instead of it, because what happened before is people say, it was my fault. The captain told me to do that. And so now they have much more ownership and the processes are better.
I love
This one happened.
Yeah, we're going to add that also to the list. You will have more than enough resources to start from. And then, of course, all of Francie's information. So I would go connect on LinkedIn. I would go maybe lurk the teeny tiny YouTube channel, whatever you need to do. But yeah, if this is definitely something where you have people walking around your organization saying, I'm not going to bring it up, but nothing's going to change, then that is a red flag that requires you to maybe take a look at this. So I appreciate you so much for coming on here and having this conversation. I think sometimes we do focus in business a lot on HR from the perspective of those numbers and retention and things. And maybe I'm going to call it a soft skill, not disrespectfully, but it's a soft skill to take this training and to be able to provide an environment where people are able to do what they need to do and not feel hesitant to come in and report things. So I appreciate this conversation. It's been really great. So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Pleasure, Dawn. Real pleasure. Have a great day.
You too. All right. Talk to y'all next time on the next episode of the Business Mastery Podcast. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Business Mastery Podcast. If you want to learn more about me, you can go to dawnkennedy.com, and you can now check us out on YouTube, as well as, of course, any of your favorite platforms that host podcasts. Take care.